Welcome everybody to another episode of Bones and Stones. Today we thought we'd discuss a new research paper that Matt Caruana, Tim Forsman, and I co-wrote with Dominic Stratford. Dominic, who's joining us all the way from a very cold and rainy New York City in the US. Now, obviously, this was an interesting project for us because we conducted it within the Cradle of Humankind, which we all know has an incredible array of fossil hominin sites. But today we'll be looking at some stone-walled structures that are, considerably younger. So to kick things off, can I maybe hand over to you and Dom, to Matt and Dom, and I know you've both obviously done extensive work in the Cradle at a range of sites. So could you maybe just talk us through the broader significance of this region, from a Pleistocene perspective, and what the areas contributed for our understanding of early human evolution?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Yeah, so the Cradle of Humankind obviously has been a place where lots of people have been looking for fossil hominins. That's sort of ancestors of ours that were living in the cradle, between about maybe 3.5 million years ago, right until about a couple of 100,000 years ago. And it really is because of the caves that we find in that region, really is one of the prime locations on the planet to research this quite interesting time period. And the reason it is quite interesting is because it tells us a lot about the evolution of ourselves, and it tells us a lot about the evolution of different parts of us as well. So for each of the different types of hominin species that we find in the cradle, and we find greater diversity of hominin species here than we find anywhere else in the world in such a small area, is remarkable. For each of those different species, they tell us a little bit of a different story about the evolution of different parts of us. So whether or not we're walking bipedally, or whether or not we're still using sort of trees as major areas that we're utilizing in terms of resources, maybe shelters, and using them for locomotion, or whether or not we're starting to broaden our diets and move out into sort of the more dangerous open areas, whether or not we're starting to use stone tools, whether or not we're starting to use fire, whether or not we're starting to live in larger groups. All of these things, each one of those species starts to tell us a little bit about that story. And so since about the 1930s, the Cradle of Humankind really has been a global focal point for this kind of research.
Thanks, Tom. That's really interesting. Kerry, can I bring you in on that? Do you want to maybe add some things there?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Matt. One of the other sort of records that is preserved in the Cradle of Humankind, which complements the fossil record, is the archaeological record. We have an incredible sort of span of stone tools that are found at various sites in the cradle that range right back into the sort of Old Awan industry. And that is a sort of more expedient core and flake industry that is roughly dated between about 2.6 to 1.4 million years ago in Africa, associated with late Australopiths and species of early Homo, like Homo habilis. We also have a great record of Acheulean stone tools, known for their hand axes and cleavers, slightly younger than that, from approximately 1.7 to maybe the last 5 to 300,000 years. Less known, we also do have Middle Stone Age sites in the Cradle of Humankind, as well as some later Stone Age occurrences. Unfortunately, those are less researched because the focus in the cradle has been so sort of driven by these early hominins. And we essentially do find sites where there are Middle Stone Age and later Stone Age sort of occurrences preserved, but the focus has really been on the earlier Stone Age. And it's an incredible record when we look at the sort of time, the technology that is preserved at these sites, along with the fossil record. They help us really understand something about the behavior of these early hominin species when we start to look at how they were making tools and start to think about, how they were using these tools as well.
Fair enough. Well, thanks very much, Dom and Matt, for explaining that. Yeah, just thinking about from a Middle Stone Age perspective, I know at least looking at the Swartkrans Middle Stone Age assemblage, with it being made predominantly on quartz, I think I know why a few people have chosen to look at that Middle Stone Age assemblage, purely because it's so difficult to work on. I know Dr. Morris Sutton spent a lot of time scratching his head when he was analyzing those artifacts. But I'm just going to hand over to Tim quickly. He's got a question for you guys.
Yeah, just before I ask my question, Kara, if you need a toe, just blink twice, okay? Because it looks like you. I hope you. Yeah, all right. Dom, I just wanted to pick on something you mentioned about the diversity of species in the area.
Mm.
Is that diversity because of some unique environmental or ecological conditions that are present there, or is it just because the preservation of these fossils is so great that you get a much broader picture of what's going on?
That's a really good question, and it's a question I don't think we're capable of answering at the moment. So there are a couple of places. So the Cradle of Humankind is split into sort of three sort of portions. So you've got the main Cradle of Humankind, which is the one around Johannesburg and just near Magaliesburg, and then you've got the Makapan Valley, which is 300 k's to the north, where we get Australopiths, and we might get some slightly different species of Australopith. And then you move down to Taum, of course, which is the place of discovery of the first Australopithecus. So it looks like certainly during Australopithecine time periods, then you get quite a broad sort of spread of both maybe different species, but then also geographical spread of these Australopithecines. It's probable that it's a bit of both, and that you do get some biasing in terms of the preservation conditions in this cradle area, where you have these caves that create perfect little sediment traps. But also there, you could say, hang on a second, there's something going on here, that we're seeing particularly abundant species of hominin. It's not to say that they are necessarily evolving right here, but it is saying that, hang on a second, there is something going on here in this part of the country that means that there are potentially lots of different things existing on the same landscape at the same time. But one of the things that's quite difficult to tell, and one of the things that's quite difficult to tie together, is hominins to a very specific ecological record, to a very specific, potentially archaeological record. So because these things tend to fall into the caves, and because the assemblages are really heavily time averaged, it's quite difficult to say we know that hominin survived in that landscape at that time with that faunal record, with that archaeology. And so that's a lot of our work. In fact, probably the majority of our work is trying to figure out those associations so that we can start to put this picture together with a little better resolution than what we've traditionally had.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Dom. Yeah, just a follow-up question. It's actually just sort of to clarify it for some of the listeners, perhaps. You sometimes hear about these things being called death traps, these holes into the caves, these chimneys that go down. Can you just talk a little bit about how the fossils are accumulating when they're still bones, accumulating inside these caves a bit? Because, I mean, it's not just living creatures falling into the holes. There's other processes involved as well, if I'm correct.
Yeah, sure. Matt, do you want to talk to this?
Yeah, well, I mean, I can sort of give a partial answer there. Well, one of the very unique things about these cave systems is that there are lots of trees that grow around them. Sort of taproot trees like wild olives and things like this tend to cluster around these rocks. They act as sort of natural fire barriers from the valleys below that have more forested and grassland areas. And so there's a very unique ecology with tree systems, caves, and water, because these cave systems, you often find sort of pooled water. These types of taproot trees will often cluster around, and that provides a very good environment sometimes for large carnivores, something like leopards, and if we're to go further back in time, something like Dinofelis. And these animals were probably that they were apex predators at the time and probably predating on hominins. In some cases, we have some good evidence for that at some of these cave sites. For instance, Swartkrans and the famous SK54 skull, which has these two beautiful puncture marks that are attributed to as a leopard kill. And in any case, these sort of cave systems would have acted as unique ecological places where potentially predators would bring back their prey. They would eat them, consume them, and the sort of body parts that weren't consumed would then fall to the ground and eventually would be washed into the cave systems. So there's a number of sort of unique sort of circumstances that would lead to the accumulation of bones.
Thanks so much.
So I'll just add to that a couple of things. Just this, the whole death trap idea is is what we see in specimens like Littlefoot, where essentially you get one complete individual either running away from something, or it's dark, or for whatever reason, one of these fairly small, I mean, we're looking at entrances that are maybe a couple of meters by a couple of meters. And then just that just opens up into a larger chamber 30 meters underground. So it's pretty easy before you have use of fire, before you're really able to navigate in the dark. It's pretty easy to sort of sympathize with something like an Australopithecus or Paranthropus, or actually we still find things falling into these caves, literally just stumbling over and falling into the cave itself. We find lots and lots of primates potentially doing the same thing as well. So it's a combination of sort of death trap like things, literally just in whole individuals falling in, predators accumulating, like Matt said, and then things dying very close to these entrances, and maybe bits and pieces getting washed in.
Cool, thanks.
Thanks very much. I mean, it's an incredibly rich record, and obviously we've had our heads in the cave, for lack of a better expression, for several decades. Obviously investigating the different hominins and the different fauna that's preserved there. But if I can maybe shift the conversation now to our paper, we are now looking at archaeology that's preserved on the surface, and this is much younger archaeology. So this was obviously something that was quite new for all of us. So maybe if I can bring Tim in here. How did we become aware of this younger archaeology on the landscape? So how did this project all come about?
Well, this is probably actually best answered by Dom, because he's the one who initially started chatting to the landowners and who was contacted by them. But it wasn't obviously just this study that we did that brought awareness around this landscape in the more recent past, because Revel Mason had been moving around there many, many years ago in the 60s, recording archaeological sites, and a lot of them very similar stone-walled structures or settlements to the one that we're going to talk about. Revel Mason had also been excavating Iron Age sites in the area like Broederstroom, for example, which is a really prominent and important Iron Age site in terms of local histories, because it's one of, if not the earliest Iron Age site in the region. So it's a really old one in terms of Iron Age. And then, of course, it's also become moved back a little bit in time. Lynn Wadley's PhD was conducted on this landscape as well, with her excavations at Jubilee Shelter and Cave James. Now, if you think of Broederstroom as being a very significant Iron Age settlement because it's so early, her work at those two shelters was also very significant in terms of the trajectory of archaeology in Southern Africa, because she started to use ethnography to understand archaeological deposits in the later Stone Age. And in particular, she looked at dispersal and aggregation patterns, which have been recorded amongst Kalahari hunter-gatherers. She looked at how we can identify that in the archaeological record. And this is really significant because it's influenced the way we've understood later Stone Age past for a very long time. So she's not the only one to have done it. Other people did it. Aaron Maisel, for example, in the same sort of time frame. But it's coming out of this landscape. So there is an awareness of some really important archaeology other than this really early Stone Age stuff, like the earlier Stone Age and the Middle Stone Age and the hominins, that is present and available in this region. So I think it's this bigger sequence that's definitely available to us, but it's what we've been chatting about now. That's kind of what's dominated the headlines, and with very good reason. I mean, it's one of the most special places in the world for that kind of stuff. It makes sense. But there is this other sort of layering to the heritage of this landscape. And so, Dom, maybe you can just take over in terms of how that project started with the collaboration with the landowners.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So it's a bit of an interesting situation in the Cradle, and something we touched on in the paper is that this landscape has experienced a whole bunch of sort of population turnover. So lots of people have moved in and lots of people have moved out through various pressures. And so there's a bit of a stigma around documenting and also sort of volunteering and admitting that you have sort of some younger, potentially sort of human age archaeology on your landscape. So people are very worried about things like finding graves on their landscape and things like this. There's within the Cradle, there's a whole bunch of sort of legislation about what landowners are allowed to do on their properties in terms of construction, in terms of moving material. And so there's usually and often a fairly interesting relationship between landowner the cradle management systems that sort of administer the area, and then also archaeologists like ourselves. And so it often requires a landowner to be particularly open-minded about trying to invite and trying to learn more about the landscape, which is where we come in, and where sometimes we're invited to go and have a look at this stuff. And that's exactly what happened. The folks over at Nirox, which is a sort of an art type sort of, lack of a better word, like an open air gallery, like a system of workshops where they invite artists to come and engage with communities and engage with the landscape. They had engaged with PAST, the Paleontological Scientific Trust, to try and start to tap into the deeper history of that landscape. And so PAST contacted me and said, listen, do you want to come and have a conversation about trying to really embellish the story, to try and get sort of the community and artists and local academics, everyone talking in one forum. And that's a really exciting idea. And so they invited me, and then basically as soon as I turned up and they said, oh, we've got some stone walling on this site, I said, right, we've got to talk to Tim. Tim is the man for the stone walling stuff and LSA. And so I said, listen, great person to bring along. Let's start having a conversation and see what we've got here. Because as Matt said, and it's very true, I tend to be quite blinkered in terms of the Stone Age, in terms of the later and then the Iron Age. So yeah, we need to get an expert on board, and Tim stepped in.
Great. Well, thanks for explaining that. And Tim, maybe just talk us through, what did we actually find? You know, what was on the actual landscape? I mean, obviously there were stone-walled structures. We know that much. But could you maybe talk us through some of the individual features of these stone-walled structures?
Yeah, sure. So basically the idea with the project was to go in there and record the site, and then use that information that we gathered from our various protocols. Mapping was the primary method we used, to try and calculate potentially what period of time the site belongs to or fits in with, and then perhaps even what kind of typology the settlement belongs to as well, which could inform us on potential occupant identities too. So it began with a quick visit to the site, followed by a short survey around the site to map out the extent of the site, and then 2 successive mapping program visits, basically, which involved a combination of handheld GPS work, which is literally just walking over the walls or next to the walls and mapping out the boundaries, followed by work with a Trimble, which is what obviously we did as well, as the 3 of us did. So those were the 2 programs that we instituted. And from that, we were able to develop a fairly accurate map of the settlement. And what we noticed, or what you could see originally without even mapping, is that this structure is basically divided into 2 areas, which we call the west and the east, just because of where they were located from one another. They were on a gentle slope that sloped down to the blowbunks plate, and they were perched basically on the edge of the bedrock. Both settlements had certain similarities. For example, a large enclosure outside the settlement. Each one had one of those. And then basically they're characterized by internal enclosures, generally a larger one with smaller nodules attached to that. And then a space followed by a boundary wall. There was a discontinuous boundary wall that crenated. So it sculpted around the edge of the settlement. And in that space between that boundary wall and the internal enclosures, we noticed things like huts, marked by upright rocks. Some of them had terraces, so an extension to these circular structures. There was also what are typically considered grain bin foundations, which are smaller versions of that. We found several of those. We also found 2 middens, which are Ashy Collections. Often in them is bone, ceramic material, cultural material of various types. We didn't find any though, which was quite interesting. There were just these ashy heaps. And then we also found one very interesting section of walling, which looked almost brand new. I mean, it's a sort of S-shaped wall that peels across the site, and it's in incredible condition. And then around the site, we also found openings, doorways or entrances marked by upright rocks at the ends of walls. And that was quite nice because often you don't see that. And sometimes that leads to the perception that these kinds of settlements don't have entrances. And that's led to all kinds of other ideas, which we've already spoken about, Michael Tellinger and so on. And yeah, so we examined this. We looked at the shape and the form. We used Taylor's typology, which Karim and Rodier had adopted as well. We used their typologies to try and identify potentially what period in time this settlement was occupied. And what we found is, unfortunately, we couldn't tie it down to a really narrow period, but it's sometime after AD 1400 and possibly before 1700. Although there's a couple of things in the settlement that may indicate a post-AD 1700 date, and those are the lintels. We found low-level lintels in one of the stone enclosures outside the east settlement, and also the upright rocks for the houses. Sorry, this may indicate a later date. So what this really just tells us, actually, is that this settlement was occupied pretty much in the second half of the second millennium AD, and it was occupied by Tswana-like people. It's a very complex history with a very unclear beginning as well. So, initially we thought this was sort of Tswana settlement, but when you start to look at the work, the historical work, archaeological work, the concept of Tswana at a very early stage is very blurry, because at that point you have processes of assimilation, subordination, migrations and movements, and various other things going on that it makes this identity a very tricky matter. So it's Tswana-like, and it was occupied somewhere in the last 500 years.
Oh, thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, I mean, it was a really incredible study to be a part of. But if I could maybe just direct a quick question to Matt. When we were using the Trimble, Cara, could you maybe talk us through how difficult it was to do the mapping? Oh, okay. I think we just lost Matt there. But I mean, Tim, you and I know, having tried to map with a Trimble DGPS in Iron Age settlements, when you've got trees and branches above your head, you are trying to keep the DGPS completely level as well, so that you're marking your points accurately. It wasn't an easy undertaking. So yeah, thankfully we did have some help with some University of Pretoria students as well.
Yeah, so Matt, if I can just jump in there, this is a very good lesson to students about expectations when you go to the field. We'll talk about the trouble we had doing this. We didn't do it. The students did it. So we should give them credit for climbing through the trees and getting covered in thorns. And
Exactly, yeah. But it was a really great experience. I know the students obviously enjoyed the field experience, to gain experience in that kind of work. But maybe just to wrap up, just because we're coming up on time now, Tim, would you maybe just summarize how the site compares to other larger, more well-known settlements in the area? For example, Kweneng, that Professor Karim Sadar has looked at, also within Gauteng. So could you just contextualize the site a little bit more?
I think that's something really important to think about, because these sites are not isolated. It's not that you have a settlement or a group of farmers living in an area that aren't connected to other people. And in some ways, that's perhaps the perception of what was going on in this part of the world. But actually, there's really rich and complex societies that had formed, certainly by the second millennium AD. So in this particular region, where you have sites like Kweneng and various others in the neighboring districts, these are massive, very politically organized settlements. Kweneng is particularly large. I don't know the exact dimensions of Kweneng, but in the northwest, some of these settlements are 3 kilometers long of continuous development. 3 kilometers by 1.5 kilometers. These are large urban centers. And so a lot of these sites form major political units. This particular site, however, is a lot smaller than that. So I'd imagine that it's attached to some larger organization. So it's associated with other settlements within that valley or within the extended region, but it's not a massive political center like you'd see, for example, at Kweneng. So yeah, I think that's what's interesting, and that's where I think we can start thinking about going forward and moving on with this. Is how is this landscape? How can we view this landscape as a connected social, economic, and political system? Where are the other sites? How do they fit in? Are there any excavation? Is there excavation potential? At some of these sites, to start to learn a little bit more about them, get some stricter chronology on some of them, figure out how people are living at these sites, how they're dividing up and separating domestic areas of these different settlements, and so on.
Well, thanks very much, Tim. Yeah, I think that brings us up to time now. But I think either way, it was a really interesting study, and it was great to be able to work on a paper with you and with Dom and with Matt Caruana as well. As friends and colleagues, it was a great opportunity to work together.
What Matt, what also we should point out is we are, at the end of the day, all Stone Age archaeologists. And this is our first collaborative project that we've published, and it's in the Iron Age. So I can't help but see the irony.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, something new and unique. But I think it definitely just kind of opens up the window a bit for research in the cradle, looking at these younger kind of archaeological signatures on the landscape. The fact that there is stuff elsewhere, and the fact that people like Revel Mason had already explored the area, and we do know of other sites and stuff. So there is definitely potential to expand the work. Anyways, but I think that wraps up the chat. So thank you very much, obviously, everybody, for joining us. Dominic, thank you for joining us all the way from the US. I know it's a bit
thank you
early
very much.
Stay warm.
But thanks for joining us.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. It was a fun study, and there's lots more to learn. So I'm excited.
Great. Thanks,
guys.
Yeah.